Have you ever wondered who actually invented the first car? Most people would probably say Henry Ford or maybe Carl Benz. But the truth is far more surprising. The automobile wasn't created by one person, and it certainly wasn't invented overnight. The car we know today is the result of more than 2 centuries of experiments, failures, crazy inventions, and brilliant minds that refused to accept one simple fact: that humanity would always depend on horses. Long before engines, highways, and gas stations existed, inventors were already dreaming about machines that could move on their own. Some of their creations looked impossible, some barely worked, and others were so far ahead of their time that people didn't know what to think. Yet every single one of them helped shape the modern automobile. Today, we're going back to the very beginning to discover how the first cars were born and how they completely changed the world forever. Before we can understand how revolutionary the automobile was, we need to picture what everyday life looked like before it existed. For thousands of years, transportation had barely changed. Whether you lived in Europe, America, or Asia, almost every journey depended on animals. Horses pulled carriages, wagons carried goods between cities, armies relied on horseback, and even the fastest way to send mail was by horse. It was a system that had worked for centuries, but it came with enormous limitations. Long trips could take days or even weeks. Roads turned into mud after heavy rain, and cities became overcrowded with thousands of horses that required food, water, shelter, and constant care. As populations grew during the 18th and 19th centuries, another unexpected problem appeared. Horses produced mountains of waste every single day, filling city streets with terrible smells and creating serious sanitation issues. Many people believed transportation had reached its limit, but a handful of inventors believed there had to be another way. The first serious attempts to build a vehicle without horses happened much earlier than most people realize. In 1649, German inventor Hans Hoch built a remarkable mechanical carriage powered entirely by an intricate system of springs and gears, almost like an enormous clock. It could move without being pulled by an animal, something that seemed almost magical to people at the time. The machine wasn't practical because the springs quickly lost their stored energy, but it proved that a vehicle could move under its own power. Just a few decades later, in 1672, Ferdinand Verbius designed a tiny steam-powered vehicle while serving at the Chinese imperial court. Although it was too small to carry a driver and functioned more as a demonstration than real transportation, it introduced an idea that would shape the future of engineering. Steam could create motion without relying on animals. Nearly 100 years later, French engineer Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot took that idea much further. In 1769, he built what many historians consider the first full-sized self-propelled vehicle capable of carrying a person. Designed to move heavy military artillery, Cugnot's enormous steam-powered wagon carried its own boiler at the front, using steam pressure to drive the wheels forward. It was painfully slow, difficult to steer, and needed frequent stops to rebuild steam pressure, but none of that mattered. For the first time in history, people watched a machine transport itself without a horse in front of it. Legend even says it was responsible for one of the first automobile accidents after crashing into a wall during a demonstration. Whether the story is entirely true or not, one thing is certain. Cugnot had proven that the dream of replacing horses with machines was no longer just imagination. It was becoming reality, and over the next century, inventors across Europe would race to build something even better. Although Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot had proven that a self-propelled vehicle was possible, his invention was far from practical. Steam engines were enormous, heavy, and incredibly inefficient. Before the vehicle could even begin moving, the boiler had to heat large amounts of water, a process that could take several minutes. Once it was finally underway, it traveled at walking speed and constantly needed to stop so the steam pressure could build up again. Imagine trying to travel between 2 cities while stopping every 15 minutes just to continue your journey. It quickly became obvious that while steam had potential, it wasn't the perfect solution for personal transportation. Still, inventors refused to give up. Throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, engineers across Europe continued building larger, faster, and more reliable steam-powered road vehicles. In Britain, pioneers like Richard Trevithick, William Murdoch, Walter Hancock, and Goldsworthy Gurney experimented with steam carriages capable of carrying passengers on public roads. For a brief moment, it even looked like steam-powered transportation might become the future. But surprisingly, technology wasn't what stopped the steam car. Politics did. As these unusual machines became more common, many people saw them as a threat. Horse carriage companies feared losing business, road authorities worried about damage to existing roads, and frightened citizens believed these noisy mechanical vehicles were dangerous. The pressure eventually reached lawmakers, especially in Britain, where one of the most infamous transportation laws in history was passed in 1865. Known as the Red Flag Act, it required every self-propelled vehicle traveling on public roads to be preceded by a person walking ahead while carrying a large red flag during the day or a lantern at night. On top of that, strict speed limits were imposed, often forcing these vehicles to travel slower than the horses they were supposed to replace. Imagine inventing a revolutionary machine capable of changing transportation forever, only to be legally forced to follow someone walking in front of it. The law almost completely destroyed the development of road vehicles in Britain for decades, while countries like Germany and France continued experimenting with new ideas. Looking back today, it's remarkable to realize that the greatest obstacle to innovation wasn't engineering, it was legislation. While steam was struggling to prove itself, another revolutionary technology quietly began to emerge: electricity. Today, electric cars seem like the newest chapter in automotive history, but in reality, they are almost as old as the automobile itself. During the early 19th century, inventors across Europe were already experimenting with electric motors. Hungarian inventor Enéas Jedlik built a tiny model powered by electricity as early as 1828, while American inventor Thomas Davenport soon demonstrated one of the first practical electric motors. By the 1830s and 1840s, several engineers had created small electric vehicles that could move without horses, smoke, or steam boilers. Later in the century, inventors such as Thomas Parker in England and Andreas Flocken in Germany built larger electric cars that looked surprisingly modern for their time. In fact, during the late 1800s, many people believed electricity, not gasoline, would become the future of transportation. Electric cars offered several advantages that gasoline vehicles simply couldn't match. They were quiet, smooth, easy to operate, and didn't require the exhausting process of starting a steam boiler or hand-cranking a combustion engine. Wealthy families especially appreciated them because they were clean, reliable, and comfortable. In cities like New York, London, and Paris, electric automobiles became increasingly popular among doctors, businessmen, and upper-class drivers. Some historians estimate that around the turn of the 20th century, electric vehicles accounted for a surprisingly large share of automobiles on the road. But they also suffered from one critical weakness that still challenges electric vehicles more than a century later: batteries. Early batteries were heavy, expensive, took a long time to recharge, and could only provide limited driving range before running out of power. As roads expanded and people wanted to travel farther from cities, those limitations became impossible to ignore. While steam was struggling to prove itself, another revolutionary technology quietly began to emerge: electricity. Today, electric cars seem like the newest chapter in automotive history, but in reality, they are almost as old as the automobile itself. During the early 19th century, inventors across Europe were already experimenting with electric motors. Hungarian inventor Enéas Jedlik built a tiny model powered by electricity as early as 1828, while American inventor Thomas Davenport soon demonstrated one of the first practical electric motors. By the 1830s and 1840s, several engineers had created small electric vehicles that could move without horses, smoke, or steam boilers. Later in the century, inventors such as Thomas Parker in England and Andreas Flocken in Germany built larger electric cars that looked surprisingly modern for their time. In fact, during the late 1800s, many people believed electricity, not gasoline, would become the future of transportation. Electric cars offered several advantages that gasoline vehicles simply couldn't match. They were quiet, smooth, easy to operate, and didn't require the exhausting process of starting a steam boiler or hand-cranking a combustion engine. Wealthy families especially appreciated them because they were clean, reliable, and comfortable. In cities like New York, London, and Paris, electric automobiles became increasingly popular among doctors, businessmen, and upper-class drivers. Some historians estimate that around the turn of the 20th century, electric vehicles accounted for a surprisingly large share of automobiles on the road. But they also suffered from one critical weakness that still challenges electric vehicles more than a century later: batteries. Early batteries were heavy, expensive, took a long time to recharge, and could only provide limited driving range before running out of power. As roads expanded and people wanted to travel farther from cities, those limitations became impossible to ignore. Yet inventing the automobile was only half the battle. Convincing the world that it actually worked would prove even harder. Most people dismissed Carl Benz's strange machine as an expensive curiosity. Few believed it could replace horses, and even fewer imagined it becoming part of everyday life. Sales were slow, public confidence was almost non-existent, and Benz himself struggled to convince people that his invention had a future. Then, in the summer of 1888, someone made a decision that would forever change automotive history. That person wasn't Carl Benz. It was his wife, Bertha. Without telling her husband beforehand, Bertha Benz gathered her 2 teenage sons early one morning, quietly rolled the patent Motorwagen away from the house so it wouldn't wake the neighbors, and set off on what would become the world's first long-distance automobile journey. Their destination was Pforzheim, more than 100 kilometers away, a distance that seemed almost unimaginable for such an experimental machine. Along the way, they faced broken components, rough dirt roads, steep hills, and fuel shortages. At one point, Bertha famously stopped at a local pharmacy to buy Ligroin, a cleaning solvent that served as gasoline, making that pharmacy what many people consider the world's first gas station. She even repaired the car herself during the journey, using a hat pin to clear a blocked fuel line and asking a blacksmith to fix a damaged chain. By the time they reached their destination, Bertha had accomplished something far greater than simply visiting her family. She had demonstrated to the entire world that the automobile wasn't just an invention, it was a practical machine capable of real travel. Her journey generated enormous public attention, inspired improvements to the vehicle, and gave Carl Benz the proof he needed that the future of transportation had finally arrived. After Bertha Benz proved that the automobile could survive a long journey, the world slowly began to take the idea seriously. Engineers across Europe realized that this strange new invention wasn't just a scientific experiment anymore. It had real potential. Almost overnight, inventors, mechanics, and entrepreneurs began racing to build better automobiles. Every year brought new improvements. Engines became more powerful, vehicles became more reliable, steering systems improved, and manufacturers started experimenting with different layouts and designs. What had once been an impossible dream was quickly becoming one of the most exciting technological races in history. During the late 19th century, the automobile industry didn't belong to one country or one inventor. Germany, France, Britain, and the United States were all competing to shape the future, each introducing ideas that would eventually become standard in every modern car we drive today. Among the most important names were Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach. While Carl Benz had focused on creating an entirely new vehicle, Daimler and Maybach concentrated on building smaller, lighter, and much more powerful engines. Their philosophy was simple. If engines became compact enough, they could power almost anything. In 1889, they introduced one of the first automobiles designed from scratch around their high-speed gasoline engine rather than adapting an old horse carriage. Their engineering pushed automotive technology forward at an incredible pace, and only a few years later they founded Daimler Motor and Gesellschaft, a company that would eventually merge with Benz and C to form Daimler Benz. Today, that company is known around the world by a name every car enthusiast immediately recognizes: Mercedes-Benz. It's remarkable to think that one of the most prestigious luxury brands in history traces its roots directly back to those early experiments with tiny gasoline engines and a dream of replacing horses forever. While Germany was producing groundbreaking engineering, France was becoming the world's first true automotive powerhouse. Companies like Panhard et Levasseur and Peugeot weren't simply building cars, they were defining how cars should be built. Panhard et Levasseur introduced what became known as the Système Panhard, a layout that placed the engine at the front of the vehicle, sent power to the rear wheels, and used a transmission between them. Today, that arrangement seems completely normal, but at the time it was revolutionary. Many early automobiles had engines mounted in unusual places or used steering systems that barely resembled modern cars. The French manufacturers gradually standardized these ideas, creating vehicles that were easier to drive, easier to repair, and far more practical than the experimental machines that came before. By the beginning of the 20th century, France was producing nearly half of all automobiles built anywhere in the world, making it the undisputed center of the young automotive industry. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was beginning its own automotive revolution. Dozens of inventors and small manufacturers appeared almost overnight, each convinced they had the perfect design for the future. Workshops that had once built bicycles, wagons, or farming equipment suddenly started producing motorcars instead. Companies such as Duryea, Winton, Haynes, and Oldsmobile all entered the growing industry, competing to build machines that ordinary people might actually buy. At this stage, however, automobiles were still considered luxury items. They were expensive, unreliable, and often assembled almost entirely by hand. Buying a car wasn't very different from commissioning a piece of fine furniture. Every vehicle required enormous amounts of labor, making ownership something reserved for the wealthy. The average worker could only dream of owning one. One man, however, believed that had to change. Ransom E. Olds was among the first to realize that the future of automobiles wasn't just about building better cars, it was about building them faster. Instead of constructing each vehicle individually from start to finish, Olds developed a production system using standardized interchangeable parts, allowing workers to assemble cars far more efficiently. His curved-dash Oldsmobile, introduced in 1901, became one of the first mass-produced automobiles in history. Thousands of identical cars rolled out of the factory, dramatically reducing manufacturing costs compared to traditional methods. Although his production system wasn't yet the moving assembly line most people associate with modern factories, it proved that automobiles could be manufactured on a much larger scale than anyone had imagined. For the first time, the industry began shifting from craftsmanship toward true industrial production. Then came the man whose name has become almost synonymous with the automobile itself: Henry Ford. Ironically, Henry Ford didn't invent the car. By the time he founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903, automobiles had already existed for nearly 2 decades. What Ford invented was something arguably even more important. He transformed the automobile from a luxury for the wealthy into something ordinary families could realistically hope to own. His vision was never to build the fastest or the most luxurious vehicle. Instead, he wanted to build a car that was simple, durable, easy to repair, and affordable enough for millions of people. In 1908, that vision became reality with the introduction of the Ford Model T. The Model T wasn't filled with groundbreaking luxury features or incredible performance. In fact, by modern standards, it was extremely simple. But that simplicity was exactly what made it revolutionary. Its rugged suspension allowed it to travel on rough dirt roads where paved highways didn't yet exist. Its engine was reliable enough to survive difficult conditions with minimal maintenance. And because the car used standardized parts, repairs became much easier than on competing vehicles. Farmers drove them through muddy fields. Doctors used them to reach patients in remote towns. And families suddenly found themselves able to travel farther than ever before. The Model T wasn't just another automobile. It became a machine that fundamentally changed how ordinary people lived their daily lives. Ford's greatest breakthrough came a few years later, in 1913, when his factories introduced the moving assembly line. Instead of workers walking around the factory building an entire car, the car itself moved through the factory while each worker performed one specialized task. It sounds simple today, but at the time it completely transformed manufacturing forever. Production times dropped dramatically. A Model T that had once taken more than 12 hours to assemble could now be completed in roughly 90 minutes. As efficiency increased, prices fell year after year. What had once been a luxury affordable only to the wealthy gradually became accessible to factory workers, farmers, teachers, and shop owners. Henry Ford even paid many of his employees higher wages, believing that the people building the cars should eventually be able to buy them. It was an idea that helped reshape not only the automobile industry but modern manufacturing itself. By the early 1920s, the results were astonishing. Roads that had once been filled almost entirely with horses were now crowded with automobiles. Gas stations appeared across the countryside. Repair garages became common businesses. Entire industries emerged to manufacture tires, fuel, glass, steel, batteries, and replacement parts. Families began taking vacations by car instead of by train. Small towns became connected like never before, while cities expanded outward because people no longer needed to live within walking distance of their workplaces. In just a few decades, the automobile had evolved from a noisy mechanical curiosity into one of the most influential inventions in human history. And yet, this was only the beginning. The car wasn't just changing transportation anymore. It was starting to reshape the entire world. Once the automobile became affordable, there was no going back. What had started as a strange machine that many people laughed at was now transforming nearly every aspect of everyday life. Cities began to expand in ways that had never been possible before. Families were no longer forced to live within walking distance of their jobs because they could simply drive there. Entire suburbs were built around the idea of car ownership, allowing millions of people to live farther away from crowded city centers. Roads that had once been little more than muddy paths were gradually replaced by paved highways, bridges, and long-distance road networks connecting towns, states, and eventually entire countries. Governments invested enormous amounts of money into infrastructure because they realized that automobiles weren't just changing transportation. They were changing the economy itself. The automobile also created industries that had never existed before. Gas stations appeared along newly built highways, repair shops became essential businesses in almost every town, and factories producing steel, rubber, glass, batteries, oil, and tires expanded at an incredible pace. Millions of new jobs were created, not just inside car factories but throughout entire supply chains. Motels, roadside diners, drive-in theaters, and fast food restaurants all flourished because people were suddenly traveling farther than ever before. The simple act of owning a car completely changed how people spent their weekends, where they chose to live, how they went on vacation, and even how businesses reached their customers. Few inventions in history have generated such a massive ripple effect across so many different industries. As technology continued to improve throughout the 20th century, automobiles evolved at an astonishing speed. Engineers developed safer brakes, stronger engines, enclosed cabins, automatic transmissions, independent suspension, fuel injection, turbochargers, airbags, anti-lock braking systems, and countless other innovations that drivers now take for granted. What had once been fragile three-wheeled machines struggling to reach walking speed eventually became luxury sedans capable of crossing continents in comfort, rugged off-road vehicles exploring places that had never seen paved roads, and supercars capable of traveling faster than many aircraft from the early 20th century. Every decade brought another leap forward, proving that the automobile was far from a finished invention. It continued evolving alongside humanity itself. Cars also changed culture in ways nobody could have predicted. They became symbols of freedom, independence, success, and adventure. Entire generations grew up dreaming about the day they would earn their driver's license. Movies, music, television, and motorsports helped transform automobiles into cultural icons. From Route 66 in America to the Autobahn in Germany, from Formula One circuits to the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans, the automobile became much more than transportation. It became part of human identity. Some cars came to represent entire decades, while others became symbols of engineering excellence, inspiring millions of enthusiasts around the world. Even today, classic automobiles continue to captivate collectors not simply because of their performance, but because they represent milestones in one of humanity's greatest technological journeys. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is that history seems to be repeating itself. More than a century ago, the world debated whether steam, electricity, or gasoline would become the future of transportation. Eventually, gasoline won that race, dominating the automotive industry for over 100 years. Today, however, we're witnessing another major transformation. Electric vehicles are once again becoming increasingly common, Battery technology is improving every year. Autonomous driving systems are rapidly advancing, and manufacturers around the world are investing billions of dollars into technologies that early inventors could never have imagined. In many ways, we're living through another chapter of the same story that began hundreds of years ago with a handful of dreamers trying to build a carriage that didn't need horses. When you look back at the journey, it's almost unbelievable how far we've come. It all began with spring-powered carriages, tiny steam-powered models, and enormous experimental wagons that barely functioned. Those early machines were slow, unreliable, and often ridiculed by the public. Yet every failed experiment, every broken engine, and every determined inventor added another piece to the puzzle. Hans Hotch proved that a carriage could move on its own. Ferdinand Verbiest demonstrated the potential of steam. Nicholas Joseph Cugnot built the first full-sized self-propelled vehicle. Carl Benz created the first practical automobile, and Bertha Benz showed the world that it actually worked. Henry Ford then made the automobile accessible to millions, forever changing the course of history. None of them could have imagined that their inventions would eventually shape modern civilization. Today, there are well over 1 billion cars on roads across the planet. They connect families, transport food and medicine, support emergency services, power global industries, and allow people to explore places their ancestors could only dream of reaching. Whether you're driving a classic muscle car, a vintage Beetle, a modern pickup truck, or a cutting-edge electric vehicle, every automobile on the road today can trace its origins back to those first bold experiments that seemed impossible centuries ago. And maybe that's the greatest lesson this story has to offer. History isn't always changed by the biggest or the fastest inventions. Sometimes it begins with an idea so unusual that almost everyone believes it will fail. A machine without horses sounded ridiculous to most people. But thanks to the determination of a few extraordinary inventors who refused to give up, that impossible idea became one of the most important inventions humanity has ever created. If you enjoyed learning the incredible history behind the world's first automobiles, make sure to subscribe for more stories about the cars that changed history, the legends that shaped the automotive industry, and the machines that continue to inspire generations of enthusiasts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.